I'm so glad you're here with me tonight in the Sleep Wizard's library. I'm Noah Ellis, and I have a quiet story I've been wanting to share with you. Why don't you make yourself comfortable first? Maybe pull a soft blanket around your shoulders. Let your hands rest easily in your lap, and take a slow, deep breath with me just to settle fully into this room. That's it. Just here with me now. Not long ago, I found myself wandering through a small, quiet library in England. The kind of place where the air smells faintly of old paper and polished wood. As I wandered down a narrow aisle, one book in particular caught my attention, a curious, leather-bound volume that seemed almost to hum softly in its stillness. It was a book I hadn't noticed before, and inside it I discovered a story of King Arthur I had never heard before. It was written in fading brown ink, and I thought you might like to hear it tonight. Let me share it with you now, just as I found it. The story began on a night when Arthur rode alone through the western valleys, far from Camelot's stone walls. He had left his knights behind, taking only a plain cloak and an old mare that knew the mountain paths. The chronicles say he did this sometimes, these solitary journeys to understand his kingdom's quieter corners. Rain had been falling since morning, the kind of soft, persistent rain that soaks through wool and leather without thunder or wind to announce it. Arthur's cloak hung heavy on his shoulders as the mare picked her way down a narrow track between dripping hawthorn trees. The path was more mud than road now, and he could smell peat smoke drifting from somewhere below in the valley as darkness gathered. He came upon a small settlement of 5 or 6 cottages clustered around a stone well. No church tower marked this place. No inn sign creaked in the wet evening. Just those few homes with their thatched roofs dark with rain, and thin lines of smoke rising from their centers, where the fire holes let them escape. Arthur dismounted at the well's edge. His boots squelched in the mud, and he could hear voices from the nearest cottage, though the words were muffled by the rain's steady whisper on thatch. He led the mare to the shelter of an oak tree and approached the door inside. He found more people than such a small dwelling should hold. They were pressed together on benches and stools, some standing against the walls. An old woman sat in the room's only proper chair near the central fire, and beside her stood a younger woman holding a bundle of cloth. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of damp wool. When Arthur entered, ducking his head beneath the low lintel, conversation stopped. Water dripped from his cloak onto the packed earth floor. A man near the door, beard streaked with gray, looked him over with the careful assessment country folk give strangers. The roads washed out ahead. Arthur said simply, "I'm looking for shelter." "You're welcome to what we have," the bearded man replied, though his eyes stayed watchful. "We're holding a folk court here. Old Mab is speaking judgment." Arthur looked again at the elderly woman by the fire. Her hands were gnarled with age, but her eyes were sharp as winter stars. The younger woman beside her unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing a child's wooden toy, a carved horse no bigger than a man's palm. "This belonged to my son," the younger woman said, her voice steady but strained. "It went missing 3 days past. Today I found it in Oswin's cottage." She nodded toward a thin man standing near the back wall, his face flushed red in the firelight. "I never took it," Oswin said quickly. "My own boy must have picked it up. Children trade such things." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the low ceiling. "Bring the children forward," she said. 2 boys were pushed gently through the crowd. Neither could have been older than 7 summers. One was sturdy and dark-haired, clearly Oswin's son by the matching sharp nose. The other was smaller, with hair the color of wet sand. "Whose horse is this?" Mab asked, holding up the toy. The smaller boy's eyes filled with tears. "Mine," he whispered. "My DA carved it before he died." Oswin's son looked at his feet, his hands twisting in his tunic. "Did you take it?" Mab asked him. The boy nodded, just barely. "He wouldn't let me play with it. I only wanted to look." A murmur ran through the room. In a settlement this small, such disputes could fester for generations. Arthur watched from his place near the door, water still pooling around his boots. "The law is clear," Mab said slowly. "Theft requires recompense. 3 measures of grain, or a day's labor for the wronged family." Oswin's face went white. "We barely have grain to last the winter, and my boy's too small for proper labor." The younger woman clutched the wooden horse tighter. "My son has nothing left of his father but this. The law is the law." Mab was quiet for a long moment. Rain drummed on the thatch above. Then she spoke again. "There is another way, older than Norman law or Saxon custom. The wronged may choose mercy and name their own healing." She looked at the smaller boy. What would heal this wrong? The child wiped his nose with his sleeve, thinking. Then he said, "He could help me fix the fence where the chickens get out. It's too big for just me." His mother started to speak, but Mab raised her hand. "Is this acceptable?" she asked. "OSWIN." The thin man nodded quickly, relief flooding his features. "Yes, yes. My boy will help with the fence. Then it's settled." Mab held out the wooden horse to its owner. But mark this mercy given is remembered longer than law enforced. The crowd began to disperse, people moving toward the door or settling into corners to wait out the rain. Arthur stepped aside to let them pass and found Mab's keen eyes on him. "You're not from these valleys," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, mother. I'm traveling east." She studied him for a moment longer. "Stay the night. The rain will pass by morning." Someone brought him bread and a cup of thin ale. He sat on a bench against the wall, his cloak steaming as it dried. The cottage gradually quieted as people either left for their own homes or found places to sleep. The fire burned lower, settling into glowing embers. Later, when most were asleep, Arthur found himself still awake, staring into those embers. Mab sat in her chair still, though her eyes were closed. He thought she slept until she spoke. "You've the look of someone who carries heavy choices." Arthur didn't deny it. "I've seen justice administered differently tonight than in any great hall." "Great halls need great justice," she said, eyes still closed. "Small places need small mercies." A king who knew both would be wise indeed. And if that king faced a choice between law and mercy, now she opened her eyes, and in the dying firelight they seemed to hold depths beyond her years. "I'd tell him what my grandmother told me. Law is the skeleton of a kingdom, but mercy is its beating heart. Without bones, the body collapses. Without a heart, it's already dead." Arthur was quiet, absorbing this. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter. "Your grandmother was wise," he said finally. "She lived through 3 kings and outlived 2 of them. She said the 3rd was different. Said he'd walked among common folk before he took his crown." Mab's gaze never wavered from his face. "Said his name was Pendragon." Arthur went very still. Uther Pendragon had been his father's name, a name spoken in whispers, even now, years after his death. "I'm old," Mab continued, "but not so old I can't see what's in front of me. That cloak may be plain, but the sword beneath it isn't. And your hands are too soft for common labor, but too scarred for a merchant." She leaned back in her chair. "I'll not speak of it, but remember this night when you sit in judgment in your great hall. Remember that a child's wooden horse can matter as much as a baron's gold. Remember that mercy can heal what law alone cannot." Arthur stood slowly. He reached into his purse and pulled out a silver coin. But Mab shook her head. "Keep your silver, but if you'd repay me, remember the boys, the one who took what wasn't his from loneliness, and the one who chose mending fences over extracting payment. There's a lesson there worth more than coin." He bowed to her deeply, as he would to any noble lady. Then he found an empty space near the wall and wrapped himself in his damp cloak. Sleep came eventually, filled with dreams of wooden horses and mending fences. Morning arrived, gray but without rain. Mist rose from the valley floor, and the world smelled of wet earth and growing things. Arthur's mare stood where he'd left her, patient under the oak. As he prepared to leave, he saw the 2 boys already at work on the chicken fence, the smaller one holding boards, while the other hammered, with more enthusiasm than skill. The bearded man from the night before brought him bread for the road. "The way east is clear now," he said, "though you might have done better to stay on the high road. Sometimes the low roads teach what the high ones cannot." Arthur replied. The man gave him a curious look, but said nothing more. Arthur mounted his mare and turned her toward the rising sun. Behind him, he could hear the boys laughing as a chicken escaped through a gap they hadn't yet mended. It was a good sound, he thought, the sound of small mercy working its way through the world. He rode for 3 days more before reaching Camelot. When he arrived, mud-splattered and weary, Merlin was waiting in the courtyard. The wizard's eyes held that knowing look that always made Arthur feel like a student again. "Learn anything useful on your journey?" Merlin asked mildly. "Perhaps." Arthur dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. "Tell me, Merlin, what matters more, that justice be perfect, or that it be wise?" "Ah," Merlin smiled, the expression creasing his weathered face. "You've been listening to old women in small places. One old woman. She spoke of my father. Uther knew law, but struggled with mercy. It made him strong, but brittle, like iron without tempering." Merlin walked beside him toward the great hall. "What will you choose?" Arthur thought of the wooden horse, the two boys, the fence that needed mending. "I think," he said slowly, "that a kingdom needs both bones and a heart, and perhaps the wisdom to know when to bend the one to preserve the other." That afternoon, Arthur held court as usual. A dispute came before him between two merchants, one claiming the other had cheated him of 3 gold pieces. The law was clear theft, required repayment of double the amount. But Arthur looked closer, asked more questions. He discovered the accused merchant had a sick child, that the gold had gone to healers. "The law demands 6 gold pieces in payment," Arthur announced. The accused merchant's face crumpled. "However," Arthur continued, "I offer another path. You may work for the wronged party for 7 days, your labor valued at the debt owed. And you," he looked at the accuser, "will provide food for his family while he works. That his child doesn't suffer for his father's choice." The hall was silent. This wasn't traditional justice, but both merchants, after a moment's surprise, agreed. Later, alone with Merlin, Arthur asked, "Was that wise?" "Ask me in a year," Merlin replied. "See if those two merchants become partners or enemies. Small mercies have long shadows," and he was right. Within 6 months, the two merchants had joined their businesses, the one's honesty balancing the other's compassion. Their venture prospered, and they spoke often of the king's wisdom. Arthur returned to that valley only once more, years later. Old Mab had passed, but the settlement had grown to twice its size. There was a stone marker by the well with words carved simply. Mercy remembered. The two boys had grown to men. Their farms side by side, the fence between them always kept in good repair. He never told them who he was. Some lessons he'd learned grew better in quiet soil, away from the bright light of royal recognition. But he kept a small wooden horse on a shelf in his private chambers, one that appeared mysteriously the day after his visit, carried by a traveling merchant who claimed an old woman had paid him to deliver it to the king, for remembering the note with it read, nothing more. On nights when difficult decisions pressed upon him, when law and mercy seemed at odds, Arthur would hold that little wooden horse and remember rain on thatch, smoke from a peat fire, and an old woman's words about bones and hearts. It helped him become the king his kingdom needed, not perfect, but perhaps wise, not always right, but usually kind. And in the chronicles that recorded his reign, though they spoke much of battles and quests and the great round table, they also noted something simpler, that in his time Both nobles and commoners called him Good King Arthur. Not great, though he was that too, but good it was, he would have said, the title that mattered most. The story went on to tell of other small moments, how Arthur once spent a full day helping a miller repair his wheel because the man's back was twisted with age and his sons were gone to war. How he sat through a night with a shepherd whose flock had been scattered by wolves, not offering gold but his own hands to help gather them. How these acts, small as they were, rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. There was the time he came upon a woman weeping by a crossroads. Her husband had died, owing taxes, and the collectors would take their cottage. By law, the debt passed to her. Arthur could have paid it himself, but instead he asked the tax collectors to wait 3 days. In those days, he sent word to all the nearby villages, and people came forward 12 eggs from one cottage, a measure of wool from another, a day's labor offered here and there. The debt was paid not by royal decree, but by community mercy, and the woman kept her home. These stories spread quietly, told in taverns and around hearth fires. They changed how people thought of justice, how neighbors treated neighbors. When disputes arose, someone would always ask, what would the king do if he were here, unknown among us? Merlin, watching all this, said to Arthur once, your father conquered with iron. You're conquering with something else entirely. And what is that? The radical notion that a king serves his people, not the other way around. It wasn't always easy. There were those who saw mercy as weakness, who challenged Arthur's judgments. Once, a powerful baron came to court, furious that Arthur had pardoned a poacher on his lands. The man took a deer. The baron raged. The law demands his hand. Arthur had looked at him steadily. The man took a deer to feed his children through winter. You have 100 deer. Tell me, which loss is greater, 1 deer from your 100, or a father's hand from his children? The law is the law. I am the law, Arthur replied quietly, and I say the law serves justice, and justice serves the kingdom, and the kingdom serves its people, all its people, even the hungry ones. The baron left angry, but returned a month later, subdued. He'd gone home and walked his lands, really walked them, not just ridden through on horseback. He'd seen the thin faces, the careful rationing, even in good times. He reduced his taxes and opened his forests for limited foraging. His lands prospered as his people grew stronger. This was Arthur's true revolution. Not one on battlefields, but in countless small choices, each one bending toward compassion without breaking the structure that held the kingdom together. He discovered that mercy, consistently applied, created its own form of order. People who felt heard and valued rarely rebelled. Communities that practiced mutual aid rarely fell into chaos. Years passed this way. Arthur aged, his hair silvering at the temples, lines deepening around his eyes. The wooden horse on his shelf aged too, its edges smoothed by occasional handling. Sometimes young knights would ask about it. This simple toy among the treasures of kingship. "It reminds me," Arthur would say, "that all justice begins with understanding what truly matters to people." One winter, particularly harsh and bitter, food grew scarce, even in Camelot. The court suggested rationing based on rank nobles first, then merchants, then commoners. Arthur refused. "We ration equally," he commanded, "or we feast equally. A kingdom that feeds its rulers while its farmers starve is no kingdom at all, but a slowly dying beast feeding on itself." He ate the same thin porridge as the lowest servant. He walked the winter streets, checking on the old and vulnerable. When spring finally came and the first crops grew, the harvest was shared with the same equality. The kingdom had survived, not through hoarding, but through sharing, and the bonds forged in that hungry winter lasted generations. Near the end of the story, in that old book, there was an account of Arthur's last visit to that small valley settlement. He was much older then, his steps slower, but still steady. The settlement had become a proper village, with a stone church and a market square. But the well remained, and beside it, the stone marker with its simple words. He stood there in the evening light, remembering that rainy night so long ago. A young woman approached the granddaughter of the boy with the wooden horse, though Arthur didn't know it then. "Are you lost, father?" she asked kindly, seeing his travel-worn cloak and gray beard. "No," he said, "just remembering. Did you know someone here? Once, a wise woman named Mab. She taught me something important." The young woman smiled. "My gran tells stories of Mab. Said she once counseled a king, though she'd never say which one." Arthur smiled too. Perhaps she counseled many kings. Wisdom has a way of reaching those who need it. He left before dawn, but not before leaving a purse of silver at the well with a note. The book's account ended there, with Arthur returning one last time to Camelot, carrying the lessons of a lifetime of small mercies. It's said he ruled for several more years with the same patient wisdom, and when he finally passed, quietly in his sleep, on an ordinary Tuesday, the kingdom mourned not a distant monarch, but a man who had walked among them, known them, served them. The chronicles would remember the grand battles, the round table, the noble quests. But in small villages and forgotten valleys, they remembered other things. They remembered a king who understood that justice without mercy is mere cruelty, and mercy without justice is chaos. But the two together create something worth preserving. They remembered that power's greatest use is in lifting others up, not holding them down. They remembered that every person's small sorrow matters, that a child's wooden horse can be as important as a kingdom's crown. They remembered, and in remembering, they continued the practice of small mercies, generation after generation, long after Arthur himself had passed into legend. And perhaps that was his greatest victory, not that he ruled well, but that he taught others to rule themselves with compassion. The kingdom he built wasn't made of stones and laws alone, but of countless small choices toward kindness, each one strengthening the whole. In the margins of that old book, someone had written in faded ink, "This is how good kingdoms grown, not by conquest, but by compassion." not in great gestures, but in daily choices, not through fear, but through the radical act of seeing each person's full humanity. That's where the story ended, with those words written in a careful hand, as if the scribe wanted to make sure this lesson wouldn't be lost among all the grander tales. I sat in that library for a long time after finishing it, thinking about small mercies and their long shadows, about the courage it takes to choose compassion when power offers easier paths. I thought you should hear this story, this quiet tale that never made it into the famous chronicles. Perhaps it will give you peaceful dreams of misting valleys and wisdom offered by firelight. Rest well.